Hello, and welcome to It's Your Lymph, a podcast about all things immunity, health, beauty, and longevity. I'm your host, Lisa Levitt Gainsler, and I've dedicated my entire career to working with people's lymphatic systems because the results are nothing short of astonishing. Come along as we reconnect to the flow of life and learn how to harness the power of lymph. Hi, everybody. Welcome to It's Your Lymph. My special guest today that I'm so excited about is Emeran Mayer. He's a gastroenterologist and neuroscientist interested in the mind, brain, body interactions with an emphasis on the brain-gut connection. He's the author of The Mind-Gut Connection and the latest book, The Gut-Immune Connection. Most notably, he's the founding director of the recently established UCLA Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to be on your show.
I just wanted to thank you so much personally for coming on to chat with us today. I'm such a fan of yours. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start a podcast is to have the opportunity to speak with you.
That's nice. Thank you.
That you really inspired me. And we have the same editor at Harper Wave, Julie Will.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good.
My book came out right around the time of your second book, The Gut-Immune Connection, in 2021. That's when this book came out, right? Yeah. So Julie was probably working with us simultaneously. And I was so honored that I got to work with the same editor. She's fantastic.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Yeah, she's great.
In this podcast, what I'm interested in exploring is the way different systems innervate with the lymphatic system. And there's obviously so much that goes on in the gut and the brain where the lymph flows through and is connected. So we're going to obviously talk about where you see the gut, immune, brain connection really impacting everyone's health. But before we start, we have some what we call icebreaker questions to loosen both of us up. My favorite question that I always like to ask guests is, what is your favorite place that you've traveled?
I would probably say Ladakh. I did a 6-week hike through Ladakh from starting in the capital Leh and all the way down into India by myself, and rented a horse and did this trek. It was amazing. You know, it was like walking through a moon landscape and stopping every night at a monastery. So there's monastery interspersed on that trail. Sadly, I've heard that the Indian government has built a road up that same path. So I think if I went there today, it would be a different world.
You know, in 1998, I took a year off and I traveled through India, Nepal, and Thailand. And I did some of the Annapurna circuit and spent a lot of time in northern India by myself. So traveling is one of my favorite things. So I always love to know what inspires people about the places and the people and the culture that they visited. Also, okay, next question. If your lymph could talk, what would it say?
That's a tough one.
That's why we ask that hard questions.
We would probably say, pay more attention to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have to admit, this is something, and this is why I was curious to come on your podcast. It's not something that I have incorporated into my, daily or regular routine or research routine. So it's a very interesting topic to me. And I would like to know more about it.
Yeah, well, that's just going to lead me into a question, which is, why do you think we don't learn enough about our lymphatic system?
I mean, there's a lot of things, in the medical school curriculum that we don't learn. So in my opinion, the whole brain-body interaction is a big black hole in education. I think right now still the microbiome does not really show up. So there's probably different reasons for different components of that, But the medical school is a very selective. Not sure if I should call it indoctrination, but because we've often seen medical students and so I work a lot with medical students in our center. When they first come in, pre-med students, they have an open mind, they're interested in mind, body, and spiritual things, and when they come out, they're completely different. They're really brainwashed, and I think part of it is the emphasis is so much on, molecular and mechanisms that are sort of more like the traditional medical understanding.
I've heard that in medical school, students, they learn about 15 pages on the lymph system in their textbook, but we know that the lymphatic system is part of the immune system, and all the lymph nodes that line the gut, all the lacteals, they're so important in protecting you from foodborne illnesses. It's the highway of your immune system. It's so important. So hopefully that's changing, that I'm hoping to see that. I'm hoping for more doctors, when they talk about the immune system, they mention the word lymph, right? Our lymph nodes, the lymphoid organs, all part of the conversation. So we're going to get into a little bit more of the weeds, but I have one more icebreaker question for you. Are there other self-care practices that you do for your body and your mind on a regular basis?
I have to say, that has really changed over time. When I grew up, so I grew up in this small town in the Bavarian Alps. Like hiking and climbing and skiing was sort of like the routine, and exercising 3 times a week to be in shape for these activities was kind of the, automatic. Like, you didn't think about the health benefit. You just wanted to be fit for ski races and, climbing and everything. And so there was obviously, and then there was a long period of time when I was practicing medicine where I had to neglect the physical. I didn't have the time. It was a crazy lifestyle in retrospect, spending more time on planes and airline lounges. And then with the first book about now, over 6 years ago, that changed. The microbes have helped me to realize the importance of diet, obviously. And that's kind of the role of the mind and the brain that plays in influencing the microbiome and health in general. So I would say the last 6 years or so, it's really become a very conscious effort, which takes up a significant amount of time that I didn't think I had available in the midst of my career.
I see that so much with doctors. The schedule is so demanding. There's no time to take care of yourself. You're taking care. And I think so many people can relate to that as parents or caretakers of their parents or their kids, that we're constantly taking care of other people. And it's not ingrained in us to take care of ourselves also, and how important that is for the health of every system in our body.
Exactly. And, once you realize that what you have neglected, and, there has been some collateral damage along the way in terms of, metabolic health. And so now I have developed a routine that definitely includes diet, a largely plant-based diet. This time-restricted eating, which we not always maintain, but, while traveling, it's difficult to do. Then meditative practice, in the morning and the evening, and the exercise, different forms of exercise, weight bearing and aerobic, and
Which, by the way, I know you were mentioning in the beginning how you don't know if you take care of your lymph at all. Those are parts of the piece of the puzzle of taking care of your lymph system. And just for our listeners who maybe aren't that familiar with your lymph system, the lymphatic system doesn't have that central pump to move it the way the heart pumps the blood. Lymph depends on musculoskeletal movement, those contractions, to propel that lymph fluid to the lymph node. So you are doing that with exercise, and same with healthy eating and dietary habits, and mindfulness and meditation. Deep diaphragmatic breathing works on that largest lymph vessel, the thoracic duct, to move the fluid back to the bloodstream. So you're doing it without knowing. You are taking care of your lymph system.
It's really fascinating to get to listen to you and to get this aspect of what I have been doing, that there's another health benefit from that.
I feel like I could have you here for 3 hours. So I'm going to try to get to some more of my questions, but I want to rewind for a minute and have you quickly tell us a little bit about your origin story for listeners who aren't familiar with you.
I grew up in a small town, 15,000 people in the foothills of the Bavarian Alps in southern Germany. And I was supposed to take over the family business, which was kind of opposite what I'm doing now. Um, a confectionery business with chocolates and cakes and specialties things. So not a bakery, but all these chocolate, sugar for all the good occasions in life. So it was always associated with having in mind it's food is supposed to give pleasure. And, so that was deeply ingrained. And then I decided kind of in the last minute, coming back from a post high school graduation tour around the Mediterranean. So a lot of students did that at the time. And when I came back, I had this, I had applied to medical school, wasn't really serious about it, but with my grades, I had a good chance. And so when I came home, I had this letter, the acceptance. And then I had to tell my parents I'm not taking over the business.
Did they take that okay?
It was a mixed reception. So my mother liked the idea, and my dad was obviously very disappointed because this was a family business over several generations, and that it would stop at that point. And it took a long time for him to kind of forgive me that. The point came when he needed a liver transplant for chronic hep C. I was able to get this to him at UCLA because he was too old in Germany. And so then he thanked me and said he's glad I went to.
Obviously, I want certain things for my kids, but I'm also trying to accept what they want in life and support them. It's a different generation.
It's a very different generation. We have not made this mistake with our son that there was this really strong pressure, from the parents what's supposed to do. And it's a little bit harder for him because he has to find it himself, without that guidance.
Right. Too many choices in the supermarket. It's the same thing. So you went to medical school, and then when did you get into the microbiome?
Yeah, so fast forward, my interest was always, even choosing medical school, I was always interested in this mind, the role of the mind and the brain in health. So initially I was targeted towards psychiatry. After I did the rotation there, this wasn't the kind of thing that I want to do the way it was practiced at the time. Then I did my dissertation thesis in medical school on brain-heart interactions. So very elaborate studies, took 4 years to get this done. And then I did a clinical rotation at the Mass General in gastroenterology. And that was kind of a mind-altering experience at the time. It was the time when endoscopes first were used in clinical practice. And just the way medicine was celebrated at the Mass General. I also noticed the patients with GI disorders, with gastrointestinal disorders that had most of that mind-body interactions. And at the time, it seemed like irritable bowel syndrome seemed to be the most probable or the most plausible area to get involved in to study mind-body interactions. Even though at the time that was not the teaching, the brain was not part of the IBS at all. There was a lot of resistance in meetings and grant applications and publications. And it took almost 35 years before this concept of brain-gut interactions was accepted just recently, a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And then about 10 years ago, the first studies came out, these really provocative studies from mouse models showing that the microbes in the gut might have an influence on emotion-like behavior in rats and mice. And I was very skeptical because I thought the story that we had just on brain-gut interactions was really sufficient to explain most phenomena. And it didn't have the diet in it. That was not part of it. We did a study. I was pursued by a liaison person from the company Danone of all companies. If you would be interested in doing a brain imaging study with one of their products, which has a probiotic mix in them. And I turned that down over 2 years. That guy came to me over and over in the office. And then I said, at the end, I said, okay, so if I can totally design the study without any influence from the company, we will do it. And to our huge surprise, we did see a signal in healthy women that consumed for 4 weeks a probiotic mix saw signals, changes in the brain, in brain function. That kind of convinced me that from then on, all of our studies, we incorporated the microbiome portion in it.
So wait, I want to pause you for a quick sec so that I make sure I understand what you're saying, and I want the listeners to really get at this. First of all, I just love that you're sort of like a quiet pioneer, like kind of like a stealth fox, kind of like you know where things should be going, but you want to push, the herd over there, but you're also ready to wait for the right time because you know it's coming and you know it's there. So I love that vision and persistence that you have to help break down what's going on in the body. But then seeing the efficacy, what changes? Did you see a change in a part of the brain that affects mood or emotions? What did you find?
It was brain networks involved in emotional regulation.
Emotional regulation. Okay. One of the things that you said that I think is such a parallel between lymph and microbiome and studying the gut and the brain connection. One of the reasons why I think lymph hasn't really been well understood or discussed is the lack of the ability to have the technology to see the lymph, right? Same with the microbiome, right? Same with the relationship between the gut and the brain, how having the proper tools to see this so we can prove things.
Yeah. And so, brain imaging obviously provided that tool, I forgot now how many years, 20 years ago when this first came, when the first brain imaging with fMRI study was published, I went to my mentor at the time and said, we have to use this. This is the way to move this field forward. And so we were the first ones who did these brain imaging studies, first in pain, but then also, with the microbiome and with diet.
How does our microbiome influence our physical and emotional and brain states?
Well, let me give you sort of a very quick summary of that. So there's about 40 trillion of these microorganisms throughout our gut from the stomach. H. pylori was the first microbe that, received a lot of attention. It actually starts in the esophagus all the way down to the large intestine. And these microbes are in close contact with our gut. Normally, they're separated by a mucus layer, so they don't really touch the surface of the gut. But there's sensors of the immune system that have sensors sticking into the mucus layer. And when these microbes come in contact with them, they get activated and respond. So a lot of things depends on the thickness of this mucus layer, if there is an engagement of the immune system on the other side. And so what the microbes normally do, if they don't engage the immune system, they break down many of our food components, so large molecules that cannot be absorbed in the small intestine. And that falls mainly into the categories of fiber, so many plant-based components, fiber and polyphenols / antioxidants. So those molecules get down into the intestine unabsorbed, and the microbes just wait for those because that's their food. And they break them down into smaller molecules. The best known of these are the short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which have this wide-ranging anti-inflammatory and beneficial effect on not just the gut, but immune cells in the gut and then throughout the body. So you could almost say, in addition to generating some vitamins, the microbes are the key to the production of one of the main anti-inflammatory components in our physiology. I mean, there's obviously also some cytokines, interleukin 10, which is anti-inflammatory, but in general, quantitatively, if you put it together. So we have that. Now, where do these raw substances come from for this production of these anti-inflammatory molecules? They come from our food, what we eat. And that links it closely to, what has happened in our modern diet, that these very molecules have been reduced in quantity in our food. So everything is processed, and the fiber has been taken out of rice and pasta and potatoes. And so everything that we have been eating, the fiber has been removed. So the microbes have really been starving and have it's set in motion a whole cascade of negative events. The mucus layer was thinned through this dietary changes, and now we have this, as you know, this chronic non-infectious disease epidemic going on, which essentially plays a major role. So the immune system, this low-grade immune system activation, plays a major role in all these disorders, ranging from colon cancer to Alzheimer's disease. And
yeah, I love how much you talk about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some even mood disorders, how you see some of the evidence in the gut early on, right? You'll see little precursors. How do you distinguish between somebody who has, low inflammation in the gut? How can you know if that's really going to progress into a neuroinflammatory disease down the road?
yeah, I think our routine medical way of examining and testing is not quite there yet. So this is not something. It's not something that shows up on your white cell count or any other immune parameters. People, physicians in functional medicine, they use a battery of tests where they can sort of get a better idea of this low-grade inflammation. It's not something you see on an endoscope. That's also a very important thing. We're trained to recognize lesions on the mucosal lining, but this contact of the microbes with these immune cells, these dendritic cells, does not result in inflammation, visible inflammation of the gut. Or for example, the early changes that occur in Parkinson's disease, in the enteric nervous system, in the nerves in the gut, you don't see it on regular biopsies.
You really can't see it until it's full blown with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's.
You can have a pretty informed speculation. I've now diagnosed several people, that middle-aged patients who had a sudden onset of constipation, which they didn't have before. And then, talking to their spouses, it seemed like they had this REM sleep abnormality where they was thrashing around in bed, acting out their dreams, without the normal muscular inhibition. And if you have these two things, the new onset constipation and the REM sleep abnormality, then you have a very high chance of developing Parkinson's, which may take 14 years.
Gosh, that is so mind-blowing and profound. And I just want to pause on that, because in my work, I work a lot in the gut. There's a lot of lacteals, the lymph vessels that line the small intestine. We also talk about the absorption of the short chain fatty acids into the chyle, right? How that becomes lymph, becomes that milky white color before it goes back up to the bloodstream. But I'm always talking to people about constipation. And so many people I hear, they say, oh no, my bowel movements are fine. I just have to take something in order to go to the bathroom. Or some people say they've had constipation for years. They're used to it. And I keep saying it's really something you want to help overcome.
And there are natural ways of overcoming it. Dietary wise, there's many natural things that I think people may not have been aware of. I mean, you don't have to take a medication that has major side effects.
What's a good example of something somebody can do?
There's the aloe plant, for example. There's rhubarb root, not the leaves, but the rhubarb root. And it's interesting, there's a whole science on this that you can find on the internet, that different layers of the root, it's sort of a yin and yang. They have both stimulatory and inhibitory molecules in it. So you don't get, if you eat the rhubarb root extract, you don't develop diarrhea. You can adjust it to a normal, now not everybody responds, but I have to say I've seen remarkable, reversals of people's long-standing struggle with constipation.
With the rhubarb root, that's so interesting because, you do want that peristalsis, the motility of the organs in the abdomen, so you can stimulate your bowel movement. So that would make so much sense to me, the rhubarb root and how that works.
Yeah. And so now, when you say, you look at the constipation as well, I mean, this now with the microbiome has a whole new dimension. Before people were saying if you have slow transit, you have all these toxins in you, and you need cleansing, and you need high colonics. And
I'm not a fan of the high colonics. Are you a fan of the high colonics?
No, but I have to say it's really fascinating. I mentioned this in my book as well, that there's a long history. I mean, Ayurvedic medicine, they started this. So whenever I see that something has been around for thousands of years, I think there's got to be something to that.
I think I see such a beneficial aspect for in somebody who in a disease state after they've gone through cancer treatment or a disease. But there's a lot of healthy people that do it a lot because they
Yeah,
think it's
and
beneficial. And that's where I'm like, that's a very intense on your system.
absolutely. And there's another dimension that I've seen on many of my patients. There seems to be almost like an addictive property to it. Once somebody starts on this in this direction, very difficult to get off it. Patients have told me, I cannot stop doing this. This is like
Again, I think it's like it's something external that is forcing the motility of your gut that it should learn how to do it on its own.
absolutely.
That's why I'm always recommending abdominal self-massage for people to massage their stomach to, increase that intrinsic automotoricity of the organs to do it themselves.
Yeah, no, it's and the thing that I wanted to say before, so I mean, not everybody with constipation has slow transit constipation. It may be regional, maybe just on the left side, but the microbe ecosystem obviously depends on these regional transits. So you get a different relative abundance in different parts of your GI tract if you have slow transit constipation. And that's something we don't really know yet what the consequences are, and because it's hard to measure regional changes in the microbes. We analyze the stool, which is a mix, an average of all the microbes in your intestine. But the ability, people have started to develop probes and capsules that can sample different parts. So that's also a story that's evolving, depending on technology, will take a while.
So I wanted to ask you about the gut-brain connection and the gut-brain barrier.
Yeah, the gut-brain barrier really has two components. It's the intestinal barrier, which is very efficient. We talked about before a little bit. So there's the mucus layer, actually two mucus layers, one that microbes can get through. The outer one is actually very tight and nothing can get through normally. And then you have the epithelial, so the cells lining the gut, which is another physical barrier. So we really have three mechanisms in series, and they're very efficient, but they are influenced by your diet, the efficiency, the barrier, and also by top-down influences from your brain. So chronic stress, also extreme exercise, all have a tendency to break down that or compromise that barrier. So anything that compromises it will have a negative health effect. So then you have a translocation of microbes or their components, their membrane components. They get into the systemic circulation. They can get to all the organs in your body, and they do. They, like your liver, receives dendritic cells from the gut that are activated and, becomes an inflammatory organ. But then if they want to get to the brain, they still have another barrier, the blood-brain barrier. And that's an entity that's also, it's very efficient. Normally it keeps a lot of negative things away from the brain, but it's also modifiable. And, microbes have been shown to play a big role. It's been shown in animal models that the integrity of that blood-brain barrier is influenced. If you don't have microbes in your gut, like in these animal models, it's germ-free animals, then you have a compromised barrier at the brain level.
So can they influence it beneficially as well as, in a nefarious way? Can it go both ways?
There's one thing that we know: the brain also has its immune system, and there is this communication of inflammatory molecules and actually intact microbes that can pass through that barrier and activate immune cells within the brain, and then setting off a cascade. This is sort of a relatively new concept, and many of the diseases, including long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, probably have a strong inflammatory or immune activation of the brain's immune system.
Yes, I talk about that too a lot in my work, that neuroinflammation, which is a sign which they see in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, MS, the neurodegenerative diseases. What they've also seen is, the lymphatic system, which was only discovered in 2012, which is a combination of the glial cells and lymphatic system. They just found lymph vessels in the brain in 2012, which all of us, I've been studying this work for 30 years. So all of us didn't know you have a lymph system in your brain. Why wouldn't you? But they discovered that the lymph vessels work with the cerebral spinal fluid to help clear out when you sleep some of that amyloid plaque that is indicated in those neurodegenerative diseases. So it's just such a new field.
Yeah, let me ask you a question. This is really fascinating. Is there a particular phase of your sleep? Is that during REM?
Yes, it's in the deeper, I know that it's in the deeper REM sleep. I just don't know which phase of sleep that it works with the cerebral spinal fluid.
Yeah, because thinking about, what I mentioned earlier about this REM sleep abnormality.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, there could be a link with that.
Right. When you mentioned the REM sleep and the gut issues with Parkinson's, that's exactly what I was thinking about with the lymphatic system and how it works when we sleep to wash out some of that plaque. The other thing you were talking a lot about is stress. And I always tell my clients, try not to stress about the stress in your life, but how can we clean that up? Because we do see stress as such an inflammatory process on the body, and how there's chronic inflammation, which leads to chronic illness in the body. But how do you see stress and the gut influence, and how important is that for people to change?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic. The stress response. So we spent many years studying this. I mean, it was a whole group at UCLA in the stress biology, and the acute stress response obviously is the most adaptive mechanism that animals and humans have developed, and it saved species from threats, all kinds of threats. And this response is optimized into a rapid response, engaging the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary axis, producing glucocorticoids and cortisol. But the system is not adapted, is not capable of dealing with chronic persistent stress, which we now in the modern world experience in increasing amounts. So there's hardly anybody that is not affected by this bombardment on social media and the news, and most of it is negative.
I know. I try to just get a headline of the news, and then I don't want that permeating me too much negativity.
I think still subconsciously, all of us realize just the climate change alone is one of the most negative things that humans are because the human existence is threatened by that, and so it's the brain will pursue this, and so this system now is chronically engaged, and that's when it becomes maladaptive, and that's where the immune system gets activated, and being referred to as the allostatic load. That all of a sudden the stress system mechanisms cause damage to the body, whereas before they saved us from extinction.
I want to dig a little deeper into that, and because I'll say that the two types of the stress, right? And there's also some acute stress, like you were talking about, that can be beneficial for the immune system. That's why you see people doing these ice baths that are beneficial to the immune system. But you don't want to, it should be time restricted. You don't want to have that prolonged stress response, because the body can't, what I also understand is the body will then focus on fighting something it doesn't need to fight, and not see the bigger disease.
Yeah, and I mean, there's several good examples, like the ultra marathon running or triathlon. Whereas regular physical exercise is one of the best things you can do for your health. If you go to these extremes, it becomes maladaptive. Same mechanism, and you get an increase in intestinal permeability and inflammation, and it's not a healthy thing to do. Even though people have this illusion,
you've got to watch that level of exercise, because too much is not so beneficial for the body. I think people get addicted to it.
They get addicted to it, and then come up with rationalizations why this should be healthy, but it's the same concept that the way our body and our brains respond to exercise is adaptive, is good for you. If you go beyond that, it becomes maladaptive. Like many of our functions.
I've never been such an extreme person with anything, but I think I'm also appreciating that side of myself as I get older, which is that moderate disposition that I have, which is, I want things in moderation, and which is really more of a homeostasis. Might be a little boring to the thrill seekers, but out there, but it really is so beneficial to the body over a longer period of time.
Yeah, so if you're young, obviously you're more that thrill seeker, and a lot of people get away with it without any damage. But you definitely would not want to continue this throughout your middle age and older age.
I've seen so many friends and clients who are being diagnosed with IBS, Crohn's, colitis, diverticulitis, leaky gut at an earlier age or in their 50s. There's just so much more of a prevalence. And I mean, same with cancer, and I think some of that with cancer is the diagnostic tools, but I also think it's environmental and stress and sleep and diet. But why do you think that is with people and gut disorders and leaky gut?
Yeah, I would say, part of it is that, the diagnostics, but I think a lot of it has to do with lifestyle and, staying with the theme of stress and mental disorders, which, have been increasing, like anxiety disorders. And I think during the pandemic have gone up 25%. The whole increased competition for jobs and, high paying jobs. Always seeing examples of extremely successful people on social media, but they can't do it. So young people are exposed to a very unusual amount of stress. But then it's also the diet. I mean, there's this diet fads, they go on these extreme diets for either the boys for building, the perfect body and taking all kinds of supplements. And also when you look at the popularity, for example, I always see this driving by of In-N-Out burgers, of hamburgers. The lines going down the
So
street.
long. I've been in that line for my younger son after a soccer game. I'll confess to that In-N-Out, being in that In-N-Out line.
So definitely, the health quality of food, and fortunately, there is a movement amongst younger people to look out for healthier food and go more to a plant-based diet. I mean, it's happening worldwide, actually, even in places like Argentina and Brazil. But nevertheless, I think the majority of young people are not following these guidelines and recommendations for what we call today an anti-inflammatory, diet. So
Yes, that anti-inflammatory diet. And then you also have people who are younger people who want to be thin and stay thin, which leads me to my next question. I've read that I really love the way you speak about a restricted time eating. I don't want to use the word dieting, but as opposed to this intermittent fasting phenomenon that's going on. And I just would love for you to speak to the difference between time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, and sort of what you think and see about all that.
There's sort of three things. I mean, fasting for religious or spiritual purposes is a good thing for your mind. If you're going this path, then I would definitely. If it's good for your health, it's another question. There's actually, relatively few centenarians amongst Tibetan monks. On the other hand, then you have this intermittent fasting, where people spend 1, 2, or 3 days a week eating minimal amounts or nothing. And then there's this time-restricted eating, which is essentially you don't fast. You eat the same amount, but you compress the time where you're eating to 8 hours a day instead of munching throughout the day from the time you get up to midnight when you go to bed after watching TV. So the mouse studies on fasting have been remarkably positive. So there's they've been shown. It's been now known for many decades. That longevity in mice is increased by food restriction. The human studies have not been as convincing and consistent as the mouse studies. There's some studies, well-designed studies, that with time-restricted eating that have shown a benefit on metabolic parameters, but there's also studies that have failed to show that. So there's still a controversy. And some people say, and I have to agree, this may be part of it. So when you go on this time restricted eating and you no longer can eat after your dinner at 7 o'clock, you automatically eat less because you don't, watch a movie or TV and eating your peanuts on the side. So it's quite possible that 500 calories a day are consumed less.
You consume less calories because of the time restriction. But then I guess what my question, what I always think about with intermittent fasting or fasting is women and hormones, perimenopause or menopause, or as they are entering menopause. What does that do to women?
I don't think I can give you really a positive answer. I don't know if there are studies that really have shown, particularly the premenopausal, women, if they benefit from it. Certainly may help with preventing any weight increases after menopause. But I don't know from a health benefit with the time restricted eating. One component, so this is linked to the microbes as well. So one thing that happens if you are not putting food into your intestinal system, that it switches to a different contractility pattern or movement pattern. It switches to this regular, almost like clockwork, 90-minute high intensity contractions that move from the esophagus all the way down into the colon, and they essentially cleanse your bowel, your small intestine. This whole idea of a small bowel or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, if you did this regular time restricted eating, it would probably not even exist.
So SIBO, what is the small intestinal bacteria overgrowth? For people who are listening, you're saying that time restricted eating could be beneficial for people with SIBO.
Absolutely, because it's your built-in mechanism. Biology has built that in to cleanse your gut. Imagine for 16 hours, this wave keeps moving through and moves everything that's what doesn't belong, like too many bacteria in the small intestine, moves all these back down into the colon, into the large intestine, and so. I personally think that if everybody did that, this entity of SIBO, which, by the way, is not really scientifically proven. I mean, there's a lot of skeptics of that because the way we measure it is controversial. It's not, an ion cast. And I've recently discussed this also with a well-known expert in microbiome, Martin Blazer, is one of the pioneers. He fully agrees with that that SIBO entity is not something, it was kind of created actually by a gastroenterologist in the LA area, and it's resulted in this whole thing. If you're diagnosed with this, you have to go on an antibiotic, and there've been commercial interests, or conflicts of interest with that.
Of course.
Anyway, so I tell people this is not something. You definitely should not take an antibiotic if you think you have that. Many people go on repeated courses of an antibiotic, which is terrible this day and age. And but I explained that to them, that you have your own cleansing mechanism, which you can unleash by just not eating 24 hours or 18 hours a day, or because every time the slightest thing, your power bar or your whatever you ingest will stop that mechanism, and go to this peristaltic mechanism back and forth. And
yeah, I have friends and clients that are just crippled with what they've been told is SIBO, and they're so confused about what they should eat or not eat, and they just they feel like they have no idea what they should be eating.
Yeah, and that's generally not the recommendation. The recommendation is take this antibiotic, and then it will take care of these excessive bacteria.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard you mention the vagus nerve. Can you talk to us about the importance of the vagal tone and that gut-brain connection with the vagus nerve?
Yeah, so there's multiple communication pathways between the gut microbes and the brain. The vagus nerve has probably received the most attention, and it sort of goes back to when it was realized a long time ago that there's only 10% of the fibers in the vagus nerve bundle that go from the brain to the gut, and 90% goes the opposite direction. So the question has always been, what is the signal that's being transmitted, to the brain? And so what we know today is one is there's a lot of cells in the gut itself, the immune cells, the endocrine cells, the nerve cells in the gut. They all send signals to the brain constantly, so the brain knows exactly what goes on. And now we know that there's 40 trillion microbes activating immune cells and producing their own neuroactive molecules, many of which go up through the vagus nerve. There's receptors on these sensory fibers, go up to the brain. Most of those we don't even know what they do. We know it for example, satiety hormones like GLP-1 and glucagon that act on receptors on these vagal nerve terminals. And now we also know that the cells in the gut that make and store these hormones, these satiety hormones, respond to signals from the microbes. Again, the short chain fatty acids and the secondary bile acids. So the microbes have a big role in telling the brain how satiated you are and when you stop eating. And if you cut the vagus, that mechanism is compromised.
So then if somebody is having a problem never feeling full, eating too much, work on that vagal tone.
Yeah, and so the vagal tone is not the sensory. So I told you a lot about that, that information highway that goes from the gut to the brain. The vagal tone is something that the descending, the signal the brain sends to the heart. What we measure with the vagal tone is the cardiovagal tone, part that goes to the heart, which is not necessarily the same as goes to the gut and goes to other organs. But a high vagal tone is basically been associated with health benefits, with
calming the nervous system.
Calming the nervous system, a relaxed mode, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And we know a network in the brain, the default mode network, that actually is directly linked to that vagal tone.
So then the vagal messages from the brain to the gut to not overstuff yourself. How would somebody work with that?
Certain diets, like the high-fat diet, certainly downregulates these mechanisms at the gut level. So they become less responsive to the same amount of fat. And I would say going back to a largely plant-based diet, whatever it is, if it's Mediterranean or Asian, they really exist all around the world or have existed, is probably the best way to optimize. It's the same with your receptors that taste sugar, a sweetness. If you're on a very high, like a very sweet diet on a regular basis, it will downregulate the sensitivity of your sweet taste receptors. So you need more sugar to trigger the same. An unhealthy diet will downregulate our own mechanisms that normally kick in to stop you eating these things.
You've recently announced your position as the founding director of the Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center. Congratulations. And can you tell us about that and what your role is and what you're going to be doing? And are you going to still see clients?
Yeah, this was something that a couple of my colleagues started, I think it's almost like 5 years ago. Like when we got into the microbiome research and I realized I was invited to other universities and saw how these microbiome centers popped up. So a few of us got together and said, we need to start this at UCLA. And there was, at this point, not enough institutional interest and support to do this. And there were a few huge opportunities of recruitment at the time, which did not happen. Other UCs took advantage of this and, took the lead. Then we started something like almost bootstrapping it. We said, okay, so if you don't have the finances to build up this official center, let's start these discussion groups and identify everybody on campus that works in the microbiome area and more and more faculty came to these meetings. So at the end, we had 100 people coming to whenever we had one of those seminars. So people realized that, and our division chief, very forward-looking individual, Dr. Israelian. So when I asked him, would he be ready to support this? This was like a couple of years ago. If we really build now a full-blown center out of this grassroots effort, and he said, yeah, and charged me to do this and identify the people, build the infrastructure. So we had meetings over 2 years. And initially it was a big focus on gut microbiome brain interactions, because I felt many other research institutions have gotten onto this train, 10 years ago, were so far ahead. But very few working, or none really working, in this brain gut microbiome area. And so planned this from the beginning that we would focus on that. And yeah, got a stellate group of investigators, young, investigators on very steep career trajectories, most of them women, as a matter of fact. And also there was one individual, Dr. Elaine Shao, who is probably one of the leading investigators in the non-human studies on microbiome brain interactions. So I said from the beginning, once we've set this up, she would be the candidate to take this over as the director, and which she did. A few weeks ago, it was the announcement, and I think she'll do a superb job of building this. And it's a lot of enthusiasm now. The chancellor has signed off on it, and we're also fortunate that two generous philanthropists, Mr. Goodman and Mr. Luskin, made a major donation to endow the center. So this will be around for a long time. So it's very exciting. I've actually stopped my clinical practice. I just got too busy with so many things related to both that center, but also to an activity that I've engaged in now more and more, is to disseminate this information to the public.
Yes. We need you.
Yeah, and this is really important, because I think we should not leave this to people that are not the real experts. There's so many individuals now who have taken over, who've created the voice for this field, and it's sad, that the big universities like UCLA do not counter this with their own people pushing messages on social media.
I thought, there we go again, right? Back to social media. And I think what's so challenging about the social media space is anybody can say they're an expert, right? And then anyone could get on and say, they have a huge following and say they know so much about X, Y, and Z. But, it's like the wild, wild west out there. I find that in the lymphatic health world, there's just not a lot of us that have been doing it for a long time. And same with the microbiome. Since it's such a new field, everyone can just jump on board and say that they are an expert in the field.
Yeah, and the sad thing is what has happened nowadays, people listen to the advice and information they get from people that have the largest following, as opposed to that have the highest qualifications.
Right. I say that all the time too. I know.
Which is terrible. So I've set out to really counteract this.
I'm so happy that you're exactly who we need. I love it. So
and there was kind of unanticipated success. So we signed an agreement with PBS. I will produce a documentary in November. It will come out in November. That is sort of the integration of my two books, essentially.
That's what I've been seeing you filming. You've been teasing that on your Instagram. That's what you've been filming.
Yes,
the
exactly.
PBS special. Oh, I'm so excited for that. Oh my God, that's going to be amazing. Does it have a title yet?
Just a working title, the mind-gut connection, but it's beyond that. It's really, it's going to have healthcare practitioners that are the cutting edge of this, and a few scientists. It's an interesting group of people that we identified that we're interviewing. You should do the same thing for your field, because I think so few people know about this.
I know. This is the inspiration for me to start this podcast. and to interview people like yourself who are so knowledgeable in your field, and understanding that there is that connection, lymph in the gut, right? And how that innervates with our immune system and your specialty and all these things that we can do. And also, as we're illuminating so many lifestyle changes and habits that people can adopt are simple, that can beneficially affect the gut, brain, immune, and lymphatic connection. You don't even realize you're also helping your lymphatic system when you're doing some of the things you say, like exercise, diet, sleep, stress, right? These are just some of the pillars that I talk about too.
Yeah, I definitely want to learn more from you about this. And I mean, just one comment of what you just said is, um, the science is extremely complicated, and
Right.
it will probably take another 10 years before we really understand this. But the practical implications, as I said, are very simple.
Right.
Everybody can do this today. That's
Exactly. And so sometimes I'll say that to people. Someone will say, oh, should I go get a lymph scintigraphy where they inject dye, right? And it's like, that's not that healthy for you. And to show the pathways of the lymph system, I'm like, yeah, you could go ahead and do that. But what we're going to do with lymphatic self-care and self-drainage is going to be the same.
yeah,
So
yeah.
let's just start and everyone can lay hands on themselves and do some lymphatic self-care tips to benefit every other system of their body too. All right, so this is the part of the episode where we do a segment called In and Out of Flow. So, what do you think being in flow feels like for you?
Being in flow, just the most general is
Yeah.
being in flow. Um, Trusting the system and letting go and flowing, yeah, with the natural flow. I mean, it's something I think I do practice to a large degree, and maybe not enough.
I love that. I love that. I was actually just talking to our producer Jess before you hopped on about um, I feel like I do that too. I'm in flow, or I try to be in flow, or I try to do practices to be in flow, and then sometimes the mind will come in and try to disrupt the force.
No, this is exactly what is, even on it's on a short-term basis, but even on a long-term basis, that you trust. I mean, when I look back at at my career, that I embarked on something that was against all odds, really, and stuck with it, and often doubted it. But now I see where it's leading to, where it's led to, and now I have this total trust in it. Letting it
Yes.
flow based on. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. I feel that way too. When I first started learning about the lymph system 30 years ago, everyone thought I was crazy. My parents were like, what are you doing? So then, out of flow, how do you overcome stagnation or periods where you're feeling out of flow or blocked?
I think probably the best things would be, really reevaluating, am I doing my regular exercise and meditative practices? I think that gets probably the meditation of all things, and this is simple meditation, paying attention to your breath and letting everything go that interferes with it. I think sort of it's a cleansing mechanism, just like we talked about the other cleansing mechanisms of in our gut, in our body. This
Mm-hmm.
is kind of cleansing mechanism for the brain, really.
Thank you. I think I do need to get back to my meditation practice. I think that there's been a disturbance in my voice for sure. I've studied meditation since college, really, and spent so many times in Zen centers and retreats and studying different forms of meditation. Even when I was a kid, I don't know if you know this part of my story, but my mom was diagnosed with cancer when I was 11 in the 70s. And she did Western chemo, radiation, and then brain surgery. But we had a friend, and this was in the late 70s, who was a meditation teacher. And they taught us as a family how to meditate and visualize. And so it's something we've been doing as a family since I was quite young. And I do sometimes forget just how simple it can be to just return to 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You could lie down, you can sit up, you can stand, it doesn't have to be something so complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I love that story. It just indicates, there's in many ways we have been operating on on the same wavelengths for a long time. um, so I also spent a lot of time at the LA Zen Center when I first came as a trainee to UCLA, and then it became incompatible really with a regular relationship, and certainly getting married, having
Right. Raising a family.
but now the last several years I've returned to that, and it's all there. I mean, like it comes back, the memory. It's almost like this, I'm not sure where the memory is stored, probably somewhere in your brain.
And the cells, and it's kinesthetic too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I spent a lot of time at the San Francisco Zen Center when I lived up there, and the Green Gulch Zen Center. And I went to, have you ever been to Tassajara Zen Center?
I've not been there, but it's
Go put it on your bucket list,
okay.
please.
Okay, I will.
You will. It's a special place. If you've been to the LA Zen Center, Tassajara Zen Center. It's only open April through October because it closes. It's a full monastery, October through April. And there's natural hot springs of the region, and the food is plant-based, and you go and you meditate in the Zendo, and there's different workshops you can take. It's a special, special place.
I'm definitely going to follow that. Yeah.
Thank you again so much for joining me. This has been such a true honor. I've admired you and your work for some time now, so this is a dream come true episode. And please tell our listeners where they can find you, the name of your books, upcoming projects that you're working on, so we can keep following you and learning from the source about the gut-brain microbiome connection.
So the simplest way is to go to my website, emeranmayer.com, and you'll find all sorts of information there, from podcasts, recipes, educational activities. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, the Mind Gut Connection newsletter, which comes out weekly on a variety of topics. But all this you can find on the website. My two books, the Mind Gut Connection and the Gut Immune Connection. The Gut Immune Connection will come out as a paperback in June with a slightly modified title, the Mind Gut Immune Connection. So that, and then in the end of the year will be this PBS documentary. So we're working on a recipe book, which is like what I've promoted, a largely plant-based diet, practical, and this will come out also in the summer, probably in June or July. It's called the Interconnected Plate. Interconnected for a variety of reasons. Interconnected because the Mediterranean diet is one of, like, all the Mediterranean countries during the Roman Empire were interconnected and created this diet, but also because it connects to your microbes and to your gut and to your brain. So this is almost like going to be a companion book to the Mind Gut and the Mind Gut Immune Connection.
I love that you mentioned that, because I wanted to tell people, in your book, The Gut Immune Connection, in the back, there's a whole entire section on recipes that I love. And I love the way you mentioned some of the recipes, like the breakfast. Some of the breakfast recipes are like the polyphenol bowl, or, they're broken down by, the antioxidant recipes, and how important some of these minerals and protein and vitamins that people aren't getting enough from their food. And you do such a great job of really explaining certain foods we all should be incorporating into our diet.
Yeah, the new one will be, beautiful pictures and more information as well. So those are the main things that are currently available and coming up, and hopefully there will be more.
And on social media, what's your title on Instagram?
At Emeran A. Mayer.
Great. At Emeran A. Mayer. Everyone, I want you to definitely get his books. Keep following him. He's the source he's the source. So everybody, please keep following him. Again, thank you so much for being here today. I've just loved our chat, and I just know our listeners are going to get so much out of this today too.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed, I have to say, this conversation has been particularly enjoyable.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you for touching our hearts today.